Welcome back to Mass Mutation Month. Last video we took a look at all the new discards in Mass Mutation. Today we're going to be diving into House Logos. Once again, there will be spoilers, so please stop watching now if you don't want any of the new cards spoiled for you. For the rest of us, let's get right into it. I'm Keyforge Concepts, and this is our Mass Mutation Month review of House Logos. Let's start with the House Hybrid Logos cards. Within Logos, these cards will have the ending bot in their name, and in other houses, they can be identified by the prefix techno. Their ability is Reap, discard a card from your hand. If you do, draw a card. Very Logos. The ability to discard and cycle through your deck faster is nice and will make your plays and cycling much more efficient. Now, keep in mind this effect is not optional. You will always have to discard a card every time you Reap. You won't always want to discard a card from your hand, which can make it a little tricky at certain points. Overall though, I think it's a solid effect. Next up we have Auto-Encoder, an artifact that reads, after a card is discarded from your hand, archive the top card of your deck. This is a nice little bit of tech against cards that force you to discard cards from your hand. We saw a bunch of those in our Dis House review. Within Logos, there are a few cards that discard from your hand as well, namely the House Hybrid cards we saw earlier. You could also choose to purposefully discard cards from your hand in order to get extra archives from this card. It could be an interesting decision if you feel getting another card for next turn may be more valuable than what you have in hand currently. I don't think it's amazing, and I don't think it'll be too impactful, but it's still an interesting tech card to have in your deck. Next up we have Bot Bookton, a 4-power creature with the Reap effect, play the top card of your deck. This is the mutated version of Doc Bookton. I love this callback to older cards in the set. As a tenured player, it gives me a sense of nostalgia. Even the flavor text references the past card, which is awesome. Playing an extra card potentially out of house is a very powerful effect, so expect this to be targeted down by your opponent. 4 power is solid, so it should still give it some okay staying power as well. A fun card that can get out of hand if left on board. Next we have Diametric Charge, an action with 1 Amber Pip that reads, deal 1 damage to a creature with 2 splash. This is a reverse version of Pound from AOA Brobnar, and I like it. It'll obviously be weaker against boards with only 1 creature, but it will output more damage overall, a potential 5 damage shared between 3 creatures. It is missing a bit of flexibility, however. There will be times where it's a little harder to land properly, but overall this seems like a decent spot removal card to have in House Logos. Next up we have Eclectic Inquiry, an action with 1 Amber Pip that reads, archive the top 2 cards of your deck. Overall, I think this is going to be a solid card. You won't be able to play those cards this turn, but it basically extends the size of your hand for the next turn if you decide to call your archives. The Amber Pip on top of this card really is just icing on the cake. This is a great card to have, especially at common in House Logos. Next we have Even Ivan, a 4-power creature with the action, if your opponent has an even amount of amber, steal 1. A very punny card. Anything with action steal 1 is solid, however this can only do that on even amber counts, so 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. If your deck has other amber control in Logos that can help manipulate your opponent's amber to an even number, then I think that would greatly benefit this card and amplify its effectiveness. This card is also weaker in multiples, since you won't likely be able to get multiple actions off. This is a simple but interesting take on amber control that we haven't seen yet in Keyforge. It'll be interesting to see just how impactful this card is. Next we have Odd Claw, a 5-power creature with the action, if your opponent has an odd amount of amber, steal 1. Looks familiar because this is just an odd version of Even Ivan. It's also great to see more cards that share art with each other, just like the Vinda sisters back from Worlds Collide. Oddclaw does have 1 extra power than Ivan, so I think that this gives this card an edge. However, because it takes 6 amber to forge a key, that means you cannot use Odd Claw to take your opponent off check in some situations. Now, from decks that I've seen with both Even Ivan and Odd Clawde in them, they are not exclusive of each other, and they're not paired together every time. So you can have a deck with just Ivan or just Clawde, or have a deck with both, as well as multiples of each card. Like I said about Ivan, simple but interesting amber control. It's hard to say how impactful this card will be at the moment. Next we have Infomorph, a 4-power creature that offers 2 draw enhancements to your deck. I think that the draw enhance is going to be one of the more valuable enhancements you can receive, but just because of how fast and efficient it can make your deck. I really like this card because it gives 2 of them, on top of a decent 4-power body. While Infomorph itself won't be greatly impactful when you play it in your games, you'll definitely be grateful for the draw enhancements that it gives. I think this is a great card for Logos to have again at common. Decks with 3 or 4 copies of these are going to be incredibly fast. The next card we're going to look at is Lethologica, an action with 1 amber pip that reads, discard cards from the top of your deck until you discard a Logos card or run out of cards. If you discard a Logos card this way, put it into your hand. This card is a Logos version basically of Sound the Horns from Brobnar, which I think was a little bit lackluster in its printing. However, one thing that differentiates this card from Sound the Horns is that you will stop discarding once you hit a Logos card, not just a creature. Because of this, you can use Lethologica to cycle your deck and fish for an answer or a key card that you might not have. This also means that you'll be discarding less cards on average, since it can be any Logos card and not just a creature. That's not to say Lethologica is without risks. You could accidentally discard some important cards from your other houses while using this, so it'll be important to know what cards are left in your deck and how many from each house you still have. This card has great potential in certain situations, but many times this will end up being either a risky play or even a discard in some decks. Next we have Munchling, a 3-power creature with Skirmish, as well as the fight effect. You may discard a Logos card from your hand or archives. If you do, gain 1 amber. Power 3 Skirmish makes for decent removal if you can keep this creature around. As for its fight effect, it's nice to have the flexibility of being able to choose between your hand and your archives. I can envision some Mass Mutation decks with Logos using their archives as a dumping ground for their unideal cards. Keeping them out of your deck for the game can make it easier to find and cycle to the cards you want. The fight effect can also be used in an endgame situation where you're racing to the finish and you need that pinch amber. There will be times where the fight effect falls flat and you don't want to have anything to discard, but this card does have potential in itself. The next card we have is Opposition Research, an action with 1 damage enhance, and the play effect, enemy creatures cannot reap during your opponent's next turn. Personally, I would much rather this card had an amber pip than a damage enhancement, but I suppose it's better than nothing. And yes, I'm talking about Inky Gloom from Worlds Collide. There will be times where this card prevents a huge swing or gain by your opponent, but in my experience with Inky Gloom, most of the time it was just not an impactful card. Giving it an extra something is a step in the right direction, but this still feels like an underwhelming card to me personally. Next we have Q-Mechs, a 1-power creature with the play effect, draw a card. It also has the destroyed effect, archive Q-Mechs. This is an incredible card and it's going to be amazing for cycling your deck. Now it is a common, which means that things could quickly spiral out of control with this in multiples. If you draw this card early, you could end up playing it multiple times, which is great. Because it can recur itself, this card is going to love having enhancements on it. If you're lucky enough to get a draw or an amber enhancement, or maybe even 2, you're going to be looking to play and destroy this card as much as you can to recycle those effects. Realistically, most of the time you'll probably be getting somewhere from 2 to 4 plays off of this in a game, but those 2 to 4 cards drawn substantially increases the speed that you go through your deck, and could mean the difference of finding that important card at the bottom of your deck, or just winning the game. Definitely strong, and incredibly strong if it can manage to grab any enhancements. Next is Titan Engineer, a 6-power creature that has the effect, while Titan Engineer is not on a flank, keys cost +1. This is the reverse version of Titan Mechanic, though it is not a mutant. The key cost increase works both ways, so this could end up hurting you if you're in a forge situation. And depending on how your battle line looks, you might not be able to easily move it to a flank. This also has repercussions if you want to play this to take an opponent off check, since you'll need to have multiple creatures to move Titan Engineer off the flank, at least 2 in your hand, or 3 if you have nothing on board. That being said, it's still a 6-power creature, so this is going to trade well with most creatures from other houses, and your opponent may be incentivized to kill it due to its passive effect. It's not amazing and not as reliable as Amber Control, but this card will have its place and do work in some decks. Next up, we have a Causal Loop, an action card that reads Archive a card, Archive Causal Loop. Another recursion card with the purpose of cycling your deck faster. Cards like this are why decks love having House Logos in them. Like Q-Mechs, this card is going to love having enhancements on it to potentially get multiple triggers out of them. However, I can see this card getting clunky, especially if you're archiving cards from other houses. Because Causal Loop goes to the archives with your archived card, when you pull them out of the archives in a different house, you're going to have Causal Loop taking up a draw space in your hand. With enhancements, this will be a good card. However, I think most players are going to overrate this card a lot. It's not bad per se, but I would take Q-Mechs every time over Causal Loop. Next we have Chronus, a 3-power creature with 2 draw enhancements, and the effect, after you resolve a draw bonus icon, you may archive a card. Like I said earlier, I think draw enhancements are going to be very powerful, and being able to archive a card every time after resolving one just further increases how quickly you cycle through your cards. The best part about its ability is that you archive after resolving the draw, so you could potentially archive the card you just drew. And to top it off, Chronus gives 2 draw enhancements itself. This, in a deck with other draw enhancement pips like Infomorph, is going to make it incredibly fast, efficient, and consistent. This card will be vital to the LOGOS draw and cycle engine. Next we have Fission Bloom, an artifact that gives 1 draw enhancement, and the action, the next time you play a card this turn, resolve each of its bonus icons an additional time. More draw enhancements are great, but obviously the strength of this card will be dependent on what enhancements you end up with in your LOGOS house. Resolving each of its bonus icons an additional time means that a card with 2 draw enhance icons is going to be drawing 4 cards in combination with this artifact. This could be underwhelming and potentially even a dead card in some LOGOS lists, but in enhance heavy decks, this card is going to absolutely pull its weight and do work. Next we have Forge Compiler, another artifact that reads, after your opponent forges a key, destroy Forge Compiler and ward each friendly creature. This is a very interesting way to punish a forge, and one that I think could be very powerful. Now obviously this is going to be useless if your opponent is forging their last key. Let's get that out of the way. It's also going to be useless if you don't have any creatures on board. When your opponent ends their turn in check, there are usually 2 optimal lines of play. The first one is to obviously play cards that take your opponent off of check. The second line of play, if I can't take my opponent off key, or if I think it isn't worth taking them off key, is that I try to further my plans of success with my deck, which is either taking a turn to gain lots of amber myself, or furthering my board and my board presence. And it's that last line of play that synergizes so well with this card. Having Forge Compiler down, if you know they're going to forge anyways, then you can just call a house, drop as many creatures as you can on board, and then have them all warded for your opponent's next turn. It's like betting that the value you're gaining from having these creatures warded on board will outweigh their advantage of being allowed to forge a key, which it absolutely can in many situations. Keyforge is a game of momentum and swings, and in certain circumstances this can be a huge one. The only thing I don't like about Forge Compiler is that it's uncommon, which means you could potentially get multiples of it. Multiples may increase the consistency of which you can ward your creatures and draw this card, but I think it would be overall a waste and potentially clog your hand, especially if you end up with multiples in your hand at once. This is a really fun card, and I think it's actually going to be a very strong card in Logos as well. Next, we have Krrrzzzaaap, a Logos action that reads, destroy each non-mutant creature, gain 1 chain. Every non-mutant creature for only 1 chain. I'm not saying I know better than Fantasy Flight Games, but this seems incredibly powerful. As we brushed upon in the Dis House video, there are mutants in Mass Mutation, but not that many. The majority of creatures are still non-mutants, and this just destroys all of them unconditionally. Within Mass Mutation, this will be a solid card that could potentially hurt you more than it helps, depending on how many mutants you have in your deck. But it's when this card goes against decks from other sets that this is going to get out of hand. There are a small handful of creatures outside of Mass Mutation that are mutants, which means that this card is most likely going to be wiping everything on board. I think this is just too good of a card against other sets to be printed in this fashion. Thank goodness it doesn't have an Amber Pip, but to balance this card out, it definitely needs more chains. Maybe 2 or 3 would be a fair amount. This might not be the most impactful card in your sealed games, but watch for this card to make a splash in the competitive scene against other decks. Next, we have Mutagenic Serum, an artifact with 1 Amber Pip with the Omni effect, destroy Mutagenic Serum. You may use friendly mutant creatures this turn. Not only does it have a pip, but it's Omni as well. If you have mutants in your deck to make use of this, then this has really big implications for house cheating and cross-house interactions between your cards. You could potentially be using cards on board from all 3 of your houses with this card. Additionally, from observation, a lot of the mutant cards in the set have pretty strong and interesting abilities themselves, which further increases the potential of this card. Without mutants, this obviously becomes a very lackluster card, but in the right deck, this can be immensely powerful. The next card we're going to look at is Novu Dynamo, an 8-power 2-armor creature that reads, at the start of your turn, you may discard a Logos card from your hand or archives. If you do, gain 1 Amber, otherwise destroy Novu Dynamo. If you have a Logos house with a lot of anti-synergy, like Mutagenic Serum with no mutants or Fission Bloom with no enhancements, then this card could be your saving grace. Having to discard a card every turn is a steep cost, especially on turns where you aren't even calling Logos. You'll be gaining 1 Amber every time, however, so it's not for nothing. And remember, discarding cards isn't always bad. It speeds up your draw and the rate at which you cycle your deck. If you don't discard a Logos card, it will be destroyed, so this is very feast or famine. 8 power 2 armor, though, is nothing to scoff at. This is a huge card that can potentially trade very efficiently with multiple of your opponent's creatures. It's also generating you 1 Amber a turn, so it's not like it's just a removal stick either. One interesting thing that I would like to point out here is that Novu Dynamo's passive activates at the start of your turn. This is before you go into your Forge a Key step. This means that if you start your turn with 5 Amber, discarding a Logos card for Novu will put you up to 6 Amber, after which you can Forge a Key. This can be a huge surprise factor against unsuspecting opponents. I can already see some cheeky surprise keys being forged off this card. Another big implication here is that it helps work around some Amber control cards, particularly ones that punish you for having 6 or 7 Amber. You can operate with 1 less Amber in your pool and still be able to forge on your turn with this card in play. I will say this is another card I do not want to see in multiples. Having to discard 2 Logos cards a turn might take up too many resources and shorten the lifespan of Novu Dynamo. While I think many players were apprehensive of this card and its steep cost, this has the potential to be a very powerful and threatening card in Logos. Next up, we have Professor Terato, a 4-power creature with the effect each mutant creature gains Reap, draw a card. This is another card that is going to be reliant on having other mutants in your deck. Drawing is always powerful, and being able to tack a draw onto a mutant with an already powerful Reap ability will be really good. Terato himself is a mutant as well, so he's also going to benefit from the Reap effect. Additionally, multiple Professor Teratos will stack with each other, which means you could potentially draw multiple cards from a single Reap. Be wary though, all mutant creatures gain this, even your opponents. This won't be a downside at all against non-mass mutation decks, but within the set you'll need to have board control and be wary if you're going to be playing around Professor Terato and his effect. Next up we have Adaptoid, a 4-power creature with a Capture Enhance, a Damage Enhance, and a Draw Enhance. And the effect, after you play a card with a bonus icon, for the remainder of the turn, Adaptoid gains one of the following: +2 armor, Assault 2, or Fight Steel 1. Flexibility is always nice, and this card brings it with 3 different enhancements and an interesting passive ability. Steel 1 seems like the strongest choice. However, with 4 power, unless you're fighting elusive creatures, you probably won't be activating it multiple times. 2 armor is if you want to trade with something around your weight class, like a 4-power creature, and Assault 2 if you want to punch up to something with 6 power, or kill something with 2 power or lower, hiding behind elusive without taking damage. In general, I think this card is just okay, but it should be able to prove its use in a variety of situations. Next, we're going to take a look at Animator, an artifact that has the action move an artifact to a flank of its controller's battle line. For the remainder of the turn, it is a creature with 3 power that belongs to the active house, and it'll leave the battle line at the end of your turn when it is no longer a creature. This card is such a creative way to approach artifact control. This can be used in 2 ways. This effect could be used on your own artifacts to create a 3-power creature to fight or reap with. Just make sure you don't get it killed, or else you're not going to get the artifact back. Alternatively, you can use it on your opponent's artifacts, turning them into a 3-power creature that is now vulnerable to being attacked and destroyed with either creatures or other removal effects. This is repeatable every LOGOS turn, so you could potentially destroy multiple enemy artifacts, or have an extra reap or fight on your side of the field every turn. Just be aware that this effect will not work with Animator itself. Animator would be exhausted after use, so it would go into your battle line, but you would be unable to use it since it wouldn't be ready. Additionally, if your opponent does not have any artifact control themselves, you can use your artifacts to capture Amber onto them. When those artifacts become artifacts again, they will retain the captured Amber on them, and your opponent will have no way of getting it back. I really love the design space that this card operates in, and I can see players using this in many creative ways, which I think is great for the game. This is definitely one of my favorites in Mass Mutation. Next, we have Auto-Vac 5150, an artifact with the action you may discard a card from your archives. If you do, keys cost +3 during your opponent's next turn. Otherwise, archive a card. At first glance, this seems just okay. If you have archived cards, which there is a good chance of with LOGOS in your deck, then this can be used for some emergency Amber control. Otherwise, archiving a card from hand every turn in LOGOS is not bad at all. This had Library of the Damned, and that was a fairly strong card without the extra utility of Amber control. You could get Library of the Damned in multiples though, since it wasn't uncommon. And this card seems somewhat underwhelming for a rare. It's not a bad card, but it's not super amazing in itself. Speaking of super amazing, here's Cyberclone, a 1-power creature with the play effect Purge another creature. Until Cyberclone leaves play, it has power equal to the purged creature's power and gains that creature's armor, keywords, and traits. So not only are you purging your opponent's best creature or biggest threat, but your card is turning into an exact copy of that creature that now your opponent has to deal with. This is such a huge momentum swing, and I can see this single-handedly turning board states and even games around. You could always purge one of your own creatures, but it seems pretty redundant since you would just end up with another copy of them anyways. One thing I will note is that you won't be able to get any play effects from other creatures, since by playing Cyberclone, you would have to finish resolving its play effect before you gain the play effect of that other card. This is a huge card and a really strong removal card for Logos. Next up is Library Card, an artifact with the action Purge Library Card. If you do, for the remainder of the turn, after you play a card, draw a card. This is a retooled, toned-down version of Library Access. Library Access was so strong and problematic that it was one of only 2 cards to have its text changed from Keyforge's first set. Now, Library Card's effect is the exact same as Library Access, with 2 major changes. One really isn't a change, but Library Card is purged after it's used, just like Library Access was changed to do. This prevents potential infinite combos and overcycling your deck for a massive advantage. The real change here is that this is an artifact. There's going to be at least a 1-turn delay before you can use Library Card. Your opponents can also see it coming, so they can either prepare for the onslaught or attempt to be proactive and potentially destroy Library Card with artifact control. All this being said, a toned-down Library Access is still a really good card. With all the added draw and archive effects in Mass Mutation, Logos will have an easier time setting up for massive Logos turns combined with Library Card. While its power has definitely been taken down a notch, Library Card will be a powerful and sought-after card in any Logos list. Next, we have Mind Over Matter, an action with the effect put each creature into its owner's archives. It's not a board wipe, as in it doesn't destroy anything, but it is still a board clear. Archiving all creatures has a few repercussions. First of all, it bypasses a lot of the beneficial destroyed effects that creatures have, as well as anything that would prevent Exalted Amber from going to your pool. And secondly, when your opponent does call their archives, assuming they had a few creatures from multiple houses, they're going to be in for a clunky few turns as they try to sort through their mixed up hand. You'll probably deny their end of turn draw for at least a turn or 2. While this could backfire on you, you could use it to your advantage if you had some strong play effects or enhancements on board. Overall, a situational card, but it gets the job done and it clears the board. The next card we're looking at is the Archivist, a 3-power creature that reads, if you archive the Archivist, archive it face up. While the Archivist is in your archives, instead of picking up all of your archives, you may choose to pick up any number of cards in your archives. This is a unique mechanic. We've never had any part of our archives as public knowledge. I think this is a well-designed way to make cards within the archives be impactful and allow them to trigger from there. Archiving this card will single-handedly fix any problems that come along with archiving cards, namely having to pick all your cards up, leading to clunky hands and the inability to store multiple situational cards. Archives are pretty safe. There aren't many cards that make you discard from your archives, so while the Archivist is in your archives, you can essentially treat them like an extension of your hand, going through and only picking up the cards you know you'll need to play that turn. This also completely negates the downsides of cards like Causal Loop, allowing you to only pick up that card and not the one that you archived. I really like the design of this card, and I expect to see more cards with similar face-up mechanics in the future. Next up is It's Coming, an action with 1 Amber Pip that reads, search your deck and discard pile for either half of a gigantic creature, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Shuffle your deck. This is a procedurally generated card that is always found in decks with gigantic creatures, no matter the house. We'll be covering this card here, so I won't go over it again when we get to gigantic creatures from other houses. Keyforge in general does not have a lot of search cards. However, I think for gigantic creatures to be viable, this is necessary. Instead of having to find 2 specific cards in a deck of 36, you need to find 2 out of 3 of them in a deck of 36, which is a huge statistical difference. If you have both halves of the creature, great. If you have one half and this card, great as well, because it's virtually the same thing, just with an Amber Pip attached. The added consistency from this card is what I think will make the gigantic cards viable and playable within their decks. And finally, here it is, the gigantic Logos card, Ultra Gravitron. When you play this card, you can only play it if you have both halves of the card. It is a 10 power 3 armor creature with the play effect, archive the top 5 cards of your deck, and the Fight Reap effect, discard a card from your archives. If you do, purge a creature and resolve each of its bonus icons as if you had played it. 10 power 3 armor is a big body, though for gigantic standards it might be a little bit on the weaker side. The 3 armor will be vital, since it will really up the trading efficiency of this card, but its real power obviously is in its effects. Archiving 5 cards is incredibly powerful, even if they are all random. If you have your archive set up all nicely, then it might ruin that, but as a player you have the ability to plan ahead before playing this. Its Fight Reap effect is excellent removal. Purge means that enemy threats won't be coming back to bother you, and they won't be triggering any destroyed effects as well. Being able to resolve pips as if they were yours is just icing on the cake. Obviously, against other sets, you most likely won't be resolving any creature bonus icons, but being able to point and purge is amazing board control. It does run on ammunition from your archives, though the 5 cards you archive from the play effect should be more than enough for your games. Speaking of archiving, I think that this gigantic creature being in House Logos is very important. With all the drawn archiving cards we've seen in this set, decks are going to be able to find the parts and play Ultra Gravitron much more consistently, which may give it an edge over other gigantic creatures in other houses. One last thing I would like to point out, you can have multiples of gigantic creatures. There have been decks found that have 2 gigantic creatures in them. That's 6 total cards, 2 tops, 2 bottoms, and 2 search cards, which is half of an entire house dedicated to gigantic creatures. While extremely rare and not necessarily the strongest, these decks will be much more consistent in finding their gigantic creatures. A very thematic and very interesting boss monster for House Logos. So let's quickly review what we can expect from Logos in Mass Mutation. The biggest and most obvious one is the big increase in archiving effects that we've seen. Archiving has always been signature of Logos, but in Mass Mutation the designers have really gone out to make it a central part of their identity in the set. They also have a good amount of draw enhancements going around, which is going to greatly increase the speed and overall consistency of decks with Logos in them. As we've also seen in past sets, Logos in Mass Mutation has a lot of strong tools to combat a variety of situations, though the ones in Mass Mutation tend to be more removal oriented. However, these new cards seem to be lacking in amber control in general, and the cards we did see weren't very notable. So Logos will need to be reliant on cards from past sets or from amber control in other houses in order to keep their opponents off key. That concludes our review of the new Mass Mutation cards from House Logos. Thank you so much for watching. What cards did I underestimate? What cards are you looking forward to? Do you think Logos will be as strong in Mass Mutation as it has been in previous sets? Let me know in the comments section. Join us for our next video where we will be reviewing the new cards from House Sanctum. Thanks again, stay well, and I will see you in the next video.